Good evening, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Foreign Correspondents Club. Thanks for coming tonight. We expected a reasonable turnout. It's good you've all come. I hope you're enjoying the food. We couldn't quite replicate street food, but our chef, Kunmu, knows a little thing or two about how to handle a wok. I think the seafood noodles are supposed to be pretty good tonight if you've had some of those. By the way, if any of you enjoy a really good flavoured beer, we do have on tap up on the bar a beer we bring in from Oregon. It's a craft beer. As you probably know, it's not possible to brew craft beers in Thailand, so if you want a decent beer it has to be imported, but that's a particularly good one. You can't actually get it on draft in many places, so it's well worth splashing out that if you like the good flavour of beer. And for those who don't know me, I'm Jonathan Head. I'm on the board of the club and have been for longer than I care to remember. And I'm also the correspondent for the BBC. And just so you know, coming up in the next week, we have a programme next Wednesday looking at the disputes over the South China Sea. It's actually been presented by a colleague of mine, Bill Hayton. He's I think he's still working for the BBC now. He's worked for the BBC for a long time, but he's spent quite a bit of time in this region. Has written a book examining all the different legal claims to the South China Sea. So if you're interested in that dispute, it's really worth coming. It'll be quite comprehensive, and it's very relevant at the moment, given the difficulties Southeast Asian countries are having in challenging or standing up to China over the advances that China has made in the South China Sea. Also, for those of you who are not members of the club, do think about joining. This is a well-rehearsed speech. I've said it many times, but we're not expensive compared to many press clubs. You do get a discount on the food and drink, and you get free entry to our events. And more than that, you join a living, breathing community. It's very diverse. It's a lot more than just journalists. And in fact, we very specifically welcome non-journalists, because journalists are something of an endangered species, so we need to keep ourselves going, and at the moment all of you are helping us do that. But anyway, let's get on to tonight's topic of conversation. We're perhaps a little late on this. It was a very heated debate about a month and a half ago about street food and the future of it. It doesn't need me to tell you how important street food is to the life of this city. I can't think of any other place I've been. I've lived in quite a number of Asian cities where street food is both so fantastically varied, often, sometimes very high quality, and where it's such an integral part of life. It is a unique really combination of the way in which Bangkok people particularly live now, and the mix of Chinese and local culture, that street food has really been a part of life for a long time, and most people regard it as absolutely integral. So inevitably there was something of a shock when one official at the Bangkok Metropolitan Authority was quoted a few weeks ago saying that they were going to eliminate street food from every single one of the 50 districts in Bangkok. I don't think it is, had General Prayut said he was going to go off to farm chickens and give up on power, it couldn't have caused a bigger shock than somebody saying that. As it turns out, the official concerned, who was invited tonight to come, and he has spoken to us at the BBC, but he declined, unfortunately. He's quite articulate on the BMA's policy. He now says he was misquoted, and in fact street food will survive, but actually, and I have spoken to him at length, it is pretty clear the BMA does want to restrict street food, to regulate it, to make it more hygienic, to have it in just a few select areas, at least in the downtown area. Certainly they're going to have a bit, if they carry out their plans, it's going to have a very big impact on the street food culture in this country. Their argument being that there are just too many people using central Bangkok now for different reasons. People going to their offices, there are tourists, commuters. There's not room, in their view, on Bangkok's rather minimal pavements to have street food sellers as well, and they want it gone. They want more order, although they ferociously deny trying to turn Bangkok into Singapore, which is probably a good thing, because I don't think anyone thinks that's possible. So we're in a strange situation now where we think they're going to do something to street food. They've certainly removed it from some areas. Let's not forget that the BMA, which has been in existence since the early 1970s, has tried to remove or regulate or control street food pretty much from the very first days of its existence. So this isn't new. But it does seem a more determined campaign. So we thought it was a great idea to bring along some of the most passionate and knowledgeable street food aficionados tonight to talk through why it matters, what can be done to keep the street food culture alive, what can be done to improve it. It would have been better, ideally, if we'd had the BMA here too to defend themselves, and we're sorry they're not, and we think it's a missed opportunity. They were invited, but they felt unable to come. So without further ado, I'm going to invite our panelists to come up and take their places if you can, we will, I'll get the order of speakers up once they're sitting down. You can see your name tags there. Well, you can read their names, but I'll run through them from the other end. Philip Cornwall Smith, anyone who lived in Bangkok for any length of time will recognize Philip, one of the great chroniclers of cultural life in Thailand. The second edition of his book, Very Thai, is actually on sale at the by the door there. Do get a copy if you can. It is an absolutely fantastic, very colourful and very entertaining observation of every aspect of Thailand that you've probably come across and many that you haven't. Next to Philip is Chawadi Nulkar, who, I don't know if any of you come across her blog, Bangkok Glutton. It's a glorious, riotous run through of everything she discovers in street food here and indeed in other Southeast Asian cities. She absolutely defines somebody who's passionate about food. Her writing drips with that passion, and she's a brilliant guide to Bangkok street food. We're very pleased to have her here. We've also very pleased to have Pialak Nakayodin here, who's involved with a book which you will also see for sale there, a beautiful book on street food called Street Food 39. She's a travel writer, and they've got a Facebook page you can see we've got up on there as well. So knows a great deal about street food and all its qualities. And last but not least, David Thompson. Any of you who've ever had the privilege of eating at Nam restaurant will know that he is the man credited with reviving an almost entirely new and very high quality take on Thai food. He just told me that he's actually involved in about 6 restaurants, so he looks remarkably young and fresh for somebody who's taking on that. So David spends time here and time in Australia, but he in many ways has brought this idea of bringing out the best of Thailand, bringing in international influences to it and raising it to a very high level of cuisine. He was a pioneer. There are many others who followed in his footsteps. So Chow, if I can start with you, give us 5 or 10 minutes of your best thoughts on the state of street food.
Okay, I wrote something down. Street food is a key part of the local culture and an important draw for tourists. If Bangkok street food areas for locals are gradually cleared and tourist areas heavily regulated, as the latest plan suggests, the result will be a kind of Epcot Center Asia, and Thai street food will stop developing and growing. Does that bother anybody but me? Okay. This is a shame because Bangkok has some of the most varied, most interesting, and most delicious street food in the world. As a person who has written 2 now obsolete books about street food, I obviously love Thai street food in all its variety and chaos. If up to me, I wouldn't change it at all. But if people want more regulation and sidewalks cleared, I'm fine with that too, as long as that's what people want. Hopefully, everyone can agree on a plan that will manage to keep the free spirit of Thai street food intact while leaving it accessible to those who need it most. Perhaps a very smart property developer could even provide space for street food vendors in one of their new malls as a gesture of goodwill. I'm willing to accept anything at this point, even a Singapore-style hawker center, which I used to criticize as an enemy of competition and innovation. Street food is too important to everyday Bangkok life to enshrine it in a kind of tourist museum. Thank you.
It had the ring of a political speech about it, almost a manifesto. Pia, perhaps, Pia, can I ask you just to give your own thoughts on street food?
So please let me introduce myself first. I'm a freelance writer on travel and lifestyle for many years. And recently, my friend and I run a publishing house. also called Little Plea book. So we see an ordinary things hidden along the street, daily life, working, leisure, friendship, and family are an extraordinary that inspires every day if only you take a close look and appreciate it. So we are proudly presented our first publishing book, Street Food, 39 Places Under 100 Baht, by the Thai author Rungrod Chukmongkol. The book is about, obviously, where you can have a great street food in the area of Old Town Bangkok, like Nang Leung, Phan Pha, Bang Lampu, Thewet, Ratchawat. Street food is our way of life for a long, good time. Not only about the food, but as a cultural institution. It's here that you can find something to eat 24 hours, and it's not a frozen one. It's a freshly warm cooked food, and for everyone, all classes, professional, including some night shift people. And there is an emotional atmosphere around it that when you walk to the store or pass by moving vendor, you can't resist the good smell of it. And you have to chat with them, watching them barbecue his moving, or you can see other having noodle soup from a steam boiling pot that an uncle just pour it to your bowl. So it's also about the platform. Let's say that Pad Thai, you surely feel the difference of the whole experience when you have Pad Thai Pratu Phi and Pad Thai in an air-conditioned food court. So for myself, I grew up in an old community of Bang Rak market with all the chaos and untidy but lively market. So in short, street food is life. Thank you.
David, nobody would mistake the food served at Nam as street food. I think some people would be quite surprised to see you here as as an exponent of the benefits and the quality of street food, which most people believe is sort of essentially improvised food for lower income people.
Yeah, Jonathan, I've got to say that good eating is good eating, and you can find some decent food on the streets of Bangkok. I first came to Bangkok many years ago, about 30 years ago, and I fell in love with the delicious chaos of the streets and indeed the languid approach to living that the Thais had. The way they could maneuver obstacles, both metaphorical and also actually in the streets, and in the way they lived was engaging, enthralling, and indeed beguiling. That happy skill is so attractive and so seductive, and for me it was a compelling reason to come and live here. It wasn't about the food initially, I have to say, but then the food started to not only seduce me and beguile me, but intoxicate me, and I became obsessed by it. Not only the fine food that I try to muck around with at the moment, but also the far more the far more prevalent food, the food of the streets. Historically, of course, the food of the streets really only came about from the 19th century onwards, and it is a child of immigration, mainly through Chinese, who were urban creatures who did not cook at home as the Thai farmers did, but in fact formed the nucleus of the burgeoning Bangkok, and consequently they were fed by vendors, hawkers, and stalls that proliferated around Chinatown. And as the Chinese spilled out of that enclave, and as the streets of Bangkok were built indeed, and Bangkok grew, so too did street food grow and begin to feed that growing, hungry city. When I first came to Bangkok, there was still some type of shame attached to people eating out all too often. Certainly at night people used to eat at home, and that's the more traditional food, the more pure food of Thai food, where you have your rice and the several dishes and you share that meal. But when people were in a rush on the hoof, on the hop, outside the house, they would always have a snack. And one of the telling characteristics, indeed the national pastime of Thailand, is indeed eating and snacking, because Thais are inveterate snackers. I'm certain that if you get in the way between Thais and their food, you'll lose something very precious to yourself, usually the hand or finger that interrupts them. And that's why I'm terribly surprised by the legislation that's being purported and proposed by the BMA to regulate and indeed to remove Thai street food from the streets. It ain't just about tourism and about the pleasing panache and pastiche of making sure that Bangkok, it seems so attractive and so exotic and so native. It's also, street food serves a very profound and important function, and that is feeding the people who live in the city. And indeed performs a secondary function just as important in employing people and making sure that people have jobs and earn money. And to remove that by a government dictate seems to me preposterous, particularly a government that is so tenuous when it comes to being aware of its people and the needs of its people. I'm surprised by that, and I'm very confused by the fact that a government would even risk causing such upset and such dissatisfaction amongst the very people of whom it needs some support. Whilst there might be some need for regulation, and maybe even some need for control, I'm very dubious and very circumspect about the idea of a government legislating trying to control the organic nature, the chaotic nature, the delicious bedlam of the streets of Bangkok. But I think historically there's always been that dilemma and that dichotomy in the Thai nature. From the 19th century, when you had, under King Rama V, Ratchagantiha, when you had the civilizing attitude of Civilai, where the Thai government tried to reform its institutions so it could accord to the Western understanding of how government should perform in order for it to survive. The next generation of a government trying to alter and change and push and transform its society and country was under people in Samut Pragom, I think it is, the dictator from the 1940s, who issued a series of cultural dictates which tried to transform the Thais into a more civilized country as far as foreigners were concerned, where Thais had to change their garb, their dress, they had to kiss their wives goodbye, and they also kissed goodbye to chewing betel nuts in public too. You have on occasion governments, particularly authoritarian governments, who wish to transform Thailand into the way that they believe that Thai should be, that pudi, that facade where they wish to present to the world as they believe Thailand should be. And you must remember that the people who are proposing this are the type of people who make their beds with tight-cut hospital corners every morning. And I tell you what, that's not what Thais do on a regular basis. The attitude of Thais living is a languid laissez-faire that is so seductive and is so agreeable, and the food that they eat is as seductive and as agreeable. But it ain't just about that pleasant, seductive quality. It's about the performing of a necessary part of Bangkok to feed its people in a way that's much, much better than, say, 7-Eleven has been suggested by some government bodies, or indeed herding Bangkok and its chaos into a more regulated, rented area. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm completely opposed to the idea of food being regulated by anybody, let alone by governments, because in fact it should be done by cooks and cooks alone. And indeed, if diners and the people who don't wish to eat that type of food anymore, they can go somewhere else. If street food were to change, it must change organically and naturally by the demand of the people who actually eat it, not by governments who wish to reform and make Bangkok a cleaner, more organised city. It is a shame and a tragedy to remove that wonderful character and that important institution out of the streets and into a more regulated area. I think eating street food is perhaps the only true democratic institution that remains in Thailand, where people of all classes are prepared to sit on a stool and sup on a guatio, a noodle soup or a som tam or a pad thai and enjoy it. And that's where Thais become Thai and remain Thai, and they have some unity of culture and of meaning and of Thainess, because the one thing that every Thai has in common is the love of their food. Thank you.
that really was a manifesto. Very powerful. Philip.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I don't think I'm going to be as eloquent as David. I've got a few notes here. You might be familiar with my book, Very Thai, which is all about basically the informal culture of Thailand. And it starts off with a section on the street, and the first chapter had to be food. It's just part of the dynamic of this city, that's the priority of the people, and that's how the city should be looked at. Now, I think it's quite interesting to look back at why street food is on the street. We heard from David about how it started among vendors in Chinatown. Basically, there were millions of people coming into the city, and they lived in tight dormitories, and they weren't able to cook at home, so they cooked in these social spaces in the city where they could socialize and eat and so forth. And they were joined later by other migrants, especially Isan migrants and other people from other regions of within the country. But basically they were marginal people, and they were occupying marginal spaces within the city. They didn't have means, and they were working in between. So that's why they were on the street. And as the country's developed, this street area has now been demarcated as public space. It is being reclaimed. So a lot of the issue about this is about space and who gets to use it, why is it in so few hands, and we heard a suggestion about, well, why don't developers offer a space? That was done in a way at Sukhumvit Soi 38, where a developer had destroyed an existing street food strip, and one area that had one building that had a sheltered corner went and hosted about half of the vendors. So there is a sense of, some people do feel a sense of responsibility, but we haven't seen that kind of a plan from the BMA to go towards a hawker centre idea, or to go towards areas where there is facilities for vendors to get water, electricity, and so forth. Now, I was struck in Paris this year when I saw a market being put up. In the ground were special hooks that all of the frames could go on. There were power points, there was water pipes. It's the kind of thing that you see in a lot of Western cities these days. And I think an enlightened Bangkok government would understand that this was very essential, and that one way to solve the problem is to create plumbing, electricity, power, shelter, and these things to provide areas that are close to where people want the food. One thing that's come up in this debate is the banishing of people to somewhere far off. I remember some vendors from Tapachan were sent to a space, or offered a space in Bambua Tong. It's about as far from the center of the city as you could possibly get. There's no notion of the demand or the supply or where people's livelihoods are in that kind of action. But if you look back in Thai history, there is a long history of just telling people to go and move into another place. It's been very consistent, and actually it's the origin of a lot of old Thai communities within Bangkok. They started off as people who were told to be there, dig that canal, be there, dig that, make that wall, and then they eventually grew up into communities. So there is this sense of just a sense of being able to just tell people to go somewhere else. That it's the high-handedness that I think has struck an awful lot of people when they're hearing this debate and thinking about the consequences, not just for the food supply, but for those individuals who've maybe been in a location for decades, cooking their special noodles. A structural factor that a lot of people forget is that an awful lot of modern Bangkok homes for several decades in the expansion of Bangkok, because partly there is the street food available, do not have cooking facilities in these buildings. They're very minimal, and in new buildings, they're really only suitable for quite clean unpacking of food packages you bought at the market. They're not really suitable for Thai-style cooking with charcoal braziers and great vats of oil sending off atomized chili into the air. It's not very good in your lounge or in the room that you've got in your block. So there's a fundamental need for communal cooking to be available to literally millions of Thais. I'm sure the figures aren't precise, but I saw that one figure that there was 40% of Bangkokians eat some form of street food every day. And I should think it goes up within a week. It's probably something like 2/3. And a lot of working mothers and working household, if it's a house husband, they don't have enough time to cook as well. They maybe have latchkey kids and they need to bring food home in a plastic bag. And there was that phrase, metung plastic, that was very big around the time I came to Bangkok, because it was such a struggle with the commute to get cooking done in your day. I think that there's a sense in which Bangkok's going through a massive transformation. A lot of spaces that used to be a shop house on one side and vendor carts on the other, with a lot of social interaction between them, a lot of community and bonding, that's had the legs cut off it by the shop houses being demolished and a condo being put there and a blank wall, or it could be an office block where there's a man with a whistle who prevents anyone from doing anything in front of that commercial building. So there's also beneficiaries of this policy. It's not just a question of 7-Eleven. If you look at places that do have space, you start to see opportunities for malls with forecourts. If you go to somewhere like Ratchadar, you'll see dozens and dozens of vendors on forecourts. But this is shifting an economy from literally probably millions of independent people who have got vending businesses to a few narrowly owned corporations that get the trade, they get the rent, they also get the income, share of everything. It's a huge narrowing of the economy into very much smaller hands. I think that's inescapable to notice. But then against that, there's also changes in the people. There has been for a long time a lot of middle class problem with street food. Many people are more conscious of health, and they see the way that oil is overused day after day. They don't like the way the dishes are washed in the street. They see the vermin. There's a video of photographs that went viral yesterday of a woman in an area in Bangkok photographing these floods of cockroaches and vermin coming out of the drains.
I hasten to say it was not my restaurant.
I mean, that can happen in the rainy season when a drain gets flooded, but the timing couldn't have been worse for this debate. There's also a Facebook page. I was trying to find it again, and I couldn't, but it was using extremely aggressive language against vendors generally. It was regarding them almost like vermin. We've heard a lot more of this kind of language in Bangkok in this political time, but I've also seen similar language used with people with folk beliefs as superstition. We also can't avoid that this is an international trend. This whole region is developing roughly in tandem, some countries going at different paces. But there have been street food purges in Ho Chi Minh City, in Jakarta, in Manila. This isn't going to change, and it's only going to increase pressure as cities look to their rival cities around the region. Which leads me to probably the biggest point, is to do with face. I don't know if it is in the motivation of this particular crackdown, but it's possible that the focus on street food and Bangkok winning a world rankings about street food could possibly have triggered a sense of looking closer at street food as a problem. There's precedent for this. If you look at countless other areas of the informal culture, whenever something is promoted that is not under central control and is of low status or is independent-minded or is messy, you immediately tend to get a clear-up reaction happening from the central authorities. You can see it in many different factors. Obviously, with things like nightlife, it's been a very major issue with all kinds of nightlife and the full moon parties, etc. The raging against backpackers and trying to get what's called quality tourists in, even though backpackers brought in so many new ideas of what could be marketed for tourism in Thailand. I remember at the Apex Summit, Pak Long Talad, which was the center where people used to buy all the vegetables and where the flower market was, that has also been destroyed as part of this crackdown. There was an enormous, like 200-meter long awning in front of it to hide the market from the international gaze. So I think that there is a sense in which a low-class, messy, cheap kind of cultural expression being the face of the country is problematic for people who think the face of the country should only be high culture and something very controlled, preferably controlled by them as part of their narrative. So I just wonder whether, in the end, issues like this are going to override the practicalities of providing food that can be affordable for the public.
Thank you very much, Philip. Look, we want tonight to be about you guys as well. I mean, there's a microphone there. Any questions, any thoughts you've got about street food? It's the kind of thing that everybody's interested in. I just wanted, before I bring Michael to the mic, Chow, when you know I've spoken about street food many times. I wonder whether, just for the benefit of, because you chronicle it so thoroughly here, if you could just give us a rundown of your greatest street food experiences, just 2 or 3 of them. It'd be really good to hear. What are the places that stick in your memory that you come back to?
I think you would probably, guess the first one, which is J5.
Why though?
I think she's the best street food cook in the country. Her ability to create all sorts of dishes out of 2 woks is incredible, and the care that she put into her food, the love, the inventiveness, because she doesn't have everything at hand. It's not a very big cooking space that she has to deal with, and the generosity that she's been cooking. She's 77-ish. How long she's been cooking this food in this open air shop house for decades. It's incredible, really.
Are there any other places that stand out for you?
I can remember the last place I went to. The last place I went to used to be at Soy 38, and he was moved. He made banh mi there. Maybe some people have eaten it. It's very, very good. But he had to leave because they weren't allowing him to use any of the water or use any of the restrooms. So he thought he would retire, and he moved to, it's like 20 kilometers away, which is it's far for Bangkok traffic. And he thought that he would never cook again. And his old customers tracked him down and asked him, when are you going to start cooking again? And he said, well, if you can find a place near my house over in this neighborhood, then sure. And they did. They found him a place near, like 5 minutes from his house. He started cooking January 31st, and he makes egg noodles with barbecued pork, but he no longer includes crab meat because that's too expensive of an ingredient where he is now. So he has substituted that with crispy pork. And the noodles are handmade, full of pork fat, delicious, glistening, buttery, everything that you would want in great noodles. And 40 baht a bowl.
J-Fi is quite a reputation. In fact, her food's very expensive because she uses such incredible ingredients. But she's this formidable old woman, wears a beanie hat and bright red lipstick on Tanong Mahachai in the old city. And if you can't afford her tom yam goong, which is unbelievably memorable, and just as an anecdote, when we at the BBC did a story about the rather bizarre invention called the Thai Taste Robot, which was invented by the government to test supposedly the most authentic of Thailand's most common dishes, J-Fi's tom yam goong virtually blew it up. The rating was so high. It's incredibly powerfully flavoured, but she does an amazing pad ki mao as well. It is quite an experience to eat there. Well worth finding her, checking her place out. Michael. Yeah.
Okay. Just to go back to what you were saying earlier about diversity and innovation, I was a bit puzzled by that, because one of the things that strikes me is you're quite often, wherever you are in the city, given the same range of dishes. And this raises a question about where does the food come from, because the other thing I've noticed is it's nearly always served in very similar looking containers. And some of it is obviously being cooked on situ, as you can see from the number of gas burners, which is another thing that, interestingly, the BMA has never worried itself about. But is there some degree of centralism? That are there people who will sell street food to vendors, or do they nearly all tend to be independent operators? And the other thing that is about the issue of the economy of these people. How much do they make on average? Are they making a decent income, or is it a scrape by each month operation? Because the other thing that came to me verbally is, I maybe shouldn't mention this, but in recent past, they all seem to be wearing shirts of a certain colour, maybe even a certain football team. And I don't think that this football team, whilst it has a strong global following, has that degree of supporting in Bangkok. Thanks very much.
I'm not quite sure we go with the questions there, but obviously the first one about them, you're suggesting they're all rather uniform.
I think if I can just begin to answer that, I think increasingly, because of the pressure of costs, some street food vendors are resorting to the more easily accessible, commercially prepared items from big corporations who also own football teams. So I think you'll find that. In the past, it wasn't always the same. And I still remember seeing down in Hua Hin, Phetchaburi, this old woman who used to do Khanomjin Sao Nam, which is Thai rice noodles, the fermented Thai rice noodles made with some dried prawns and minced pineapple. And she would go to the market every morning and just buy those ingredients and cook enough just for the day, and she would go back the next day and wasn't even aware that there was such a thing as a refrigerator or anything, aware that there was any other dish really, because it was based upon the local ingredients that were done so very well. And that's a romantic approach, and it's not a common approach, or you don't commonly come across those wonderful vendors, although there are still one or two in existence. And but increasingly, because they are running a business, they do resort to having to use convenience food and mass-prepared food, because you see they are running a business, and in order for them not to scrape by, they have to resort to those big commercial providers or purveyors. And it is, unfortunately, also therefore a compromise and has a dire effect upon the quality of some of the ingredients and some of the dishes, or resultant dishes, I'm afraid. So you do see a bastardization, but then I would say across the board, I've seen a change in Thai food. Even by the time that I've been here over the last 30 years, it's becoming more standardized, and the repertoire is no longer as broad. But then I would refer back to a person whom I admire very much as a food person, a Farang Bob Halliday, who arrived in the 1960s and talked about the glory then. And each generation looks back to the previous generation as a halcyon time, a more diverse time where food was much more delicious. And that, I guess, is a romantic approach to food. But I do think in the case of street food and indeed Thai food, generations ago had a far more diverse repertoire than sadly the economy or the exigencies of time and pressure are now forcing upon food and constraining it into a far more standardized repertoire. As for the football team, I'm afraid I can't tell you whom I follow.
Priya, could I ask you whether, I mean, have you noticed has street food quality declined in recent years? You know, is the quality overall?
Yes, they are.
In what way has it declined?
I think I'm not sure about my personal. I mean, when I was young, the food is delicious, but then when you grow up, you broaden your experience, so you find better things than the one it used to be, and then let me just say, for example, I'm a regular of a kongi in Talat, in Bangkok area. There's a famous one at the old cinema house.
Going to tell us the name?
Joplin's. So when I was young, it was very good. But right now, when I go there, it's kind of like, I think it's less delicious. Maybe because of the vendors, she's old enough, and maybe because of the ingredients, and because of the price of the quality of overall. So it's less delicious.
When you charge rent and when you have increasing costs, the only thing that you can begin to squeeze is the quality of ingredients, and that, I'm afraid, has had a tremendous effect upon the quality and diversity of what's available now, I'm afraid.
Yeah, that's what happens. And then, but from time to time, I went there for the nostalgia. But I mean, if you didn't have it before, it would be great for you. But if you like a regular from the old days, it's kind of like, maybe next time would be better. I don't know.
What about you, Chow? I mean, what's your sense about how the quality of street food? You still seem to find places on your blog that still match what you consider the good standards.
Well, I mean, prices have stayed pretty stable for the past few years.
You mean the prices of the street food?
Yeah.
But not the ingredients?
Yeah.
The sale price.
I mean, there's no way to keep that kind of quality when the prices just stay that way, right? Wages have to go up, and people have to be able to afford better food, and then vendors can charge more for good food. But I mean, otherwise, I don't know. You get what you pay for, I feel.
Indeed, but isn't it also, we're talking about it from a gourmet experience and
Yeah.
from a rather plush background, but street food also performs something more necessary. It sustains a population who can't afford the luxury of being discriminating and saying, I'll go for 20 kilometres to that old bummy place because it was so good and I can't live without it.
Yeah.
It's not, they're not as fortunate nor as lucky nor as indulgent as to be able to do so. They need to be fed, and sometimes they may not be fed with the highest quality of food, but at least they are fed, and it's certainly better than the 7-Eleven sausage.
Absolutely.
Heaven spare us from the 7-Eleven sausage, but it may well conquer all in the end. The next question, Arnaud.
Arnaud Debus, journalist. I think at some point the BMA said that street food will be preserved in the touristic area, but has to be swept away in other areas. And also the tourist minister, Kun Kopkan, said that each area must have its own style. The food styles must have their own style, different style for each area. So what do you think about this discourse that street food, that's okay for tourists, but not for Thai people?
Maybe I could take up this. I think it's partly an extension of the last thing I mentioned about face, and they didn't have control of it, and now they want control of it, and it comes down to even theming it and telling you where you can have it and only having it in tourist locations. And they added another one, which is at the very sea the very distant sea area of Bangkok in Bangkok, they are responding to the idea that street food is a tourist draw because of these awards and recognitions that Bangkok's been getting for its street food, while completely ignoring the feeding of the population side of it. But they're also missing what foreigners enjoy about street food, which isn't just the taste, it is actually the casualness. It's very hard to get this round people who think that quality comes from high status things. One of the greatest draws about Bangkok is not necessarily its high status things, it's that possibly more than any other big city in the world, you can just relax here and not have to keep up your own standards. You can just be very casual and feel very at ease in when the surroundings are not making this huge effort to intimidate you. If you go to a mall where you've got a street, a food court, malls are quite alienating for a lot of people who aren't dressed to go into them. Not everybody feels they've got access to a mall. I think it's a lot to do with that. It's face and a complete misconception, a misunderstanding of why people enjoy street food as a tourist.
Next question, please. Could you introduce yourself too?
Hi, I'm Trudy Renwick. I'm a PhD student at UC Berkeley. I'm doing research on the Siam Square and Ratchaprasong area about markets and shrines and their connections with the malls. So I was working a lot with the Polka Meka Siam before they were shut down. And so my question has to do with, I think what some of you were discussing, which is the longer history of the role of markets in the city and the policies towards those markets. And I'm curious about what you know about the motivation behind which areas are shutting down, and in particular, I'm curious about the degree to which you think there's private incentive for the shutdown of the street markets, because it's not just about food, but it's also about other types of markets as well. So I'm just curious about that.
That's a good point. One of the points that was made to me by the city government official I spoke to was that a street food in Tonle or a street food vendor might occupy a small patch of land that's worth millions of baht, and why should he have that? And he seemed to be very exercised by that idea. And you've got any thoughts on the choices of locations where street food is being cleared out? Is it being driven by money considerations, property speculation? Do we know anything about that?
I think facts on the ground show you that it's disappearing from places where condominiums are going up and office buildings are being built, partly for reasons we were discussing before we came on stage, which was simply the BMA feels that so many uses are being put to these spaces in the city that there needs to be room for enough people to flow through those spaces. But strangely enough, street vendors are incredibly efficient users of space because they come and go. Different vendors at different times can be there rather than occupying one shop. They can be a different kind of vendor at different times of the day, and not necessarily just food. It might be at other times there's clothing vendors or trinket vendors there.
Yeah, in my soy and soy Ari, we watch a change of 4 different types of selling throughout the day, and it starts with people selling alms for people to give to the monks, moves on to general services, shoe repairers, then it's lunch, and they're all different. You know, there's a complete changeover during the day. It's a remarkable use of space. Next question, please.
My name is Buzz Singer. While this issue, of course, is very much about food, it seems to me that it really is a pedestrian issue in one sense that's faced by cities all over the world, and that's the allocation and the management of public space. And there are 2 ways, I think, of looking at it, and I think we've heard both of them tonight, one from Mr. Thompson, if I understand him correctly. It's, you know, they let it organically happen, they set it up here, and that's what happens, and that becomes a community and culture, and let's preserve it. And then we have the other by Mr. Smith, who rightly pointed out my opinion that the cities all over the world are regulating, and they want to control and do all of this. But there really is a middle ground in my view, and that's there are really experts, and they exist here in Bangkok. I know some of them: architects, designers, planners, safety people, and people in cities all over the world. They sit down, they have public hearings, and they say, what is the use of this space, and how can we accommodate both the needs of the public for access, the needs of the people that we've heard about tonight, the vendors, the needs of the public, and you have hearings, and you have experts, and you have the public, and they all sit down again, and they try to work it out involving, yes, compromises. You just, in a simple thing, you take where I live between Soi 10 and Soi 12, you sit down and you say, how are we going to allocate this space so that everybody is taken care of? And I was just, wondering what the panel, is that approach something that anyone would favor? And believe me, I see the can of worms in it. Yeah. Believe me, I do.
I think that's a really interesting idea, but the problem is that the government is not actually encouraging debate or listening to people necessarily. It is imposing its will upon the community, and that is the problem. If there were an absolute debate and a sharing of ideas and a forum, that could be very interesting. But in its own way, the government is trying to reform Bangkok, trying to improve it, albeit brutally and clumsily, and ineptly probably, but they're trying to improve it to shape Bangkok into the modern city or the future city that it hopes it becomes. But in doing so, it is removing some very old communities, such as around Dalat Nam, around the older areas of Bangkok, as it starts to introduce railways or undergrounds, as it starts to introduce broadwalks along the river, as it starts to expand into parks. And again, this is the use of civic space, and is indicative of rise of the middle class that has a voice in the political discourse, and so it creates a city that allows for leisure, as opposed to the previous city, which was a city that was not managed, had no order about it, and actually just was local communities that grew up haphazardly, ad hoc, organically and chaotically, with no control or no planning. And so now Bangkok is trying to change. And so there is, I think, as you say, Philip, that desire to improve the city, but they're improving it in a way the government wishes, as opposed to the way that the people also need to. So having that debate, having that discourse, having that platform may well then arrive at a compromise that could make Bangkok a spectacular city, still maintaining its character, and yet enjoying the possibility of a city that is something that is attractive in the future. But just to arbitrarily, unilaterally impose and clean up areas without any regard for the people who are shifted, moved and harmed is, I think, very dangerous indeed, and is an action that is alienating and high-handed, and therein lies the problem.
Could I just add a point into that question? Over the past decade or so, there's actually been quite a lot of international interest in urbanism as a topic. It's been about a decade since the world, I think it was 2007, since the world became majority urban. And urbanism and cities are one of the hottest topics around the world. And one of those interesting debates that's happened in urbanism has been the model of chaotic cities, and Bangkok is the absolute poster child of this, being a possible model for the future of cities. That the old rigid structure, the Haussmann style, replanning, or the Moses in New York, sending a highway through the middle of a community, that hasn't worked in many respects, and that there could be potential to use a kind of organic structure that's maybe more like a skeleton with other things on it rather than being a complete grid and frame that everything's bolted into. But really what's happening at the moment is a wholesale destruction of the informal culture of this exemplar city. So it may not even be possible, if this goes on much longer, for much to be retrieved of that, because you start, the bonds of those vendors who work together and form communities, they can't be resolved. Down the flower market was almost the perfect example that these urbanists would talk about as being a way these things work organically, and that it's just a bulldozer sent through the middle of it, and they're not even cognizant of what they're destroying, and or let alone that there's alternative models being talked about by city planners and urbanists around the world about Bangkok offering lessons to other cities.
I think they're cognizant, but what they are is repulsed by what they see.
I mean, Charles, you as somebody who's very passionate about street food, what do you say to the argument that many people will make that they do block pedestrians? It's bloody hard to walk past some of the places with street vendors, isn't it?
Yeah, I think I have been talking to a lot, vendors themselves who say that they like cleared sidewalks, some of them. So it's kind of, I don't know, I personally am happy. I welcome as much commerce on the sidewalks as possible. But if that needs to be regulated, I guess that there's a need, then whatever can be managed in a way that would do as little damage as possible to the vendors and people who rely on street food.
It was interesting that Chulalongkorn University did, or their UDDC Urban Design Department did a survey of 1,000 people living around about their views about what was the problem for pedestrians, because they're trying to promote walking. And they discovered that street vendors were actually quite low down the list. People actually put things like motorcycles driving on the pavement and sign posts stuck in the middle as much bigger obstacles. So it's not necessarily street vendors who are the problem. Next question, please.
Hi, I'm Alex. I write for 2 magazine. Back to the saving face thing. I don't know if anyone noticed it, but recently the BMA has been putting up posters bragging about the fact that CNN rated them as the best street food city, and these are not 6 months old. I've noticed them twice in 2 different locations around the news, that the first news when they started saying that they will ban street food. Any takes on that?
They do have a very good sense of humor, don't they?
Any other thoughts on that? I mean, it was probably just timing. I don't know. They seem to be caught completely wrong-footed when they realise that CNN
I
survey.
just think they're not necessarily aware of all the implications of it. No. The level of how much do these people read about urbanism? How much they're civic leaders, but how much do they know? What's their bed table reading? If you go to cities around the world, you'll find mayors who've got huge, great bookshelves filled with books about urbanism and the creative city, and they would go out to international conferences about all this kind of stuff. Do these bureaucrats
read? Of course they do. They read Donald Trump and The Art of the Deal.
Next question, please. Yeah, Jeff.
Jeffrey Goddard, retired journalist and street food fan. I'm a regular shopper at Otogor, where there's one of the stalls sells Gangpet Yang to die for. But my question is, do you see Otogor as being a model for what might replace street food, which I think would be terrible? And I'm saying a model for people, the little people, affordable for little people to have stalls there. That's my first question. My other question is, one of my favourite street stalls is on Pratit, and it sells cow kukapi. Can you tell me what is the origin of cow kukapi?
Right, there's a challenge. Let's take the last one first.
Okay, 19th century. It was just mixing of leftover namprikapi that was left over from dinner, because often meals for lunch was using up leftovers from the night before, and of course, since relishes were so important, a part of the meal, the leftover relish, the namprikapi, was mixed with rice and mixed with the muwan, the sweet pork, and an omelette, and et voila, you have a primitive version version of your your kalkukapi. And so you have various versions of that, some mixed with numprik pao chili jam, others mixed with tamarind. It's a whole range of ingredients, but the one that's most prevalent and agreeable is that numprik or kalkukapi. And it's interesting to see very often, originally, as far as I can understand, street food was quite distinct, a different genre to the food that was eaten at home. But that was when most people did eat at home or had cooks at home, and so the snacks that were available on the streets, those hybridized snacks, the Chinese and Siamese combination, or indeed the desserts and small snacks in those older markets that were the favourites of the Thais, were quite distinct from the food that one ate at home. But then as fewer people began to cook at home, Thais still like eating that food, and so you had an entrepreneurial vendors who provided the food that was once the province of the house, spilling out onto the streets and into the marketplace, feeding the Thais who wanted to eat that food. And so that is the organic nature of how Thai food and its repertoire expanded, including your favourite on Tanon Praiti.
Yeah. The other question I think was about whether the hawker centre model is appropriate for street vendors.
I remember Otokor when I first came in the 1980s, and it wasn't quite like the way it is. It's just one of a miracle and one of the accidents where a government can actually make a market work. I don't know whether you can actually make street vendors and haul them in and corral them into a market like that, because what will happen is the rent that's charged will mean that fewer people can afford to go into them or can afford to eat in them, and therein lies a problem.
I also would go to the Otokor market because I'm sure that they sell very good thing, good quality, and even it's pricey, but it's good one. So we tend to pay for it, and it's kind of like a model for other market, but in each area there is a local market there. So you just go to the local market, but when you need a special things or very good quality, you go there.
I think you also must remember that a market is a market, and it's always been in a contained area, whereas street food is by its very nature chaotic and spreads out onto the streets and spills out along the alleyways. And to try and contain that may in some ways compromise the very nature of it and the laissez-faire, easygoing snookness that you were talking about, and the sabiness that is a delightful hallmark and an engaging aspect of those vendors.
I think one thing that has happened is there is a slight difference in how street food is, the definitions rather. To some degree, we're talking about street food as a cuisine, and then there's street food as locations. And street food isn't disappearing from markets. One of the things that happened over time is that markets tended to push the vendors to the outside because that's where the customers were, and the center of markets around Bangkok got hollowed out. You see it in Jattajak as well. And a friend was talking to me about how he had to go further away to get his favorite food that used to be on the stalls in his soy, but he can go to the local market, and now the market's got vendors throughout it, and the vendors there, so he can have that food. So we might see maybe a revival of the local market. Maybe that is a food, it's a food court mixed with market food, produce available perhaps. I mean, there may be a way to reinvigorate the local market as a social centre, as an urban opportunity.
Next question, please.
My name is Dylan. So my question is about, if you look at countries like Germany, say, one thing you notice when you go in supermarkets there is how cheap the food is, and I think the accommodation there is quite cheap. They don't necessarily have street food, but I think Germany does quite well from the fact that the quality of living is quite good there. You don't have to pay a lot to live there, and it makes the country quite competitive because companies can they can produce goods. They don't have to pay their workers nearly as much as some of the neighbors, for example. and I'm wondering what the effect, what the knock-on effect could be for Thailand if Bangkok doesn't have as mixed demographics. If all the people that were, could only be paid, small amounts, if their way of living doesn't really work for them anymore, then the economy changes and all the wages go up, and some of the goods that get exported will be uncompetitive. So do you think it will have this knock-on effect?
Is Bangkok, well, let's say, is Bangkok, is it a high-cost city for people who want to run street food stalls? Is it unaffordable? I think there's a very valid point about the cost of food. Food is not cheap in Thailand. Outside of Bangkok, it's a lot cheaper, but in Bangkok, even in markets, it's surprising how expensive it is. Why is that? Is it Thai retail sector not efficient? We're straying a bit, aren't we? Yeah.
The gasoline is increasing up. The gasoline and the fuel is increasing. Is always their excuse to raise up the price.
But you buy food. What do you think about the price of food?
It's more expensive than before.
Yeah.
A lot more. Right now, when you have 100 baht, you buy nothing. When you go even to the local market, you need 500 baht instead of 100. And you can have only 2 noodle soup. It's more expensive. I don't know why, but the government maybe.
Clearly we need another panel on the economics of food production in Thailand. We can answer your question then on street
I'd like
food.
to know the answer as well.
Next question, please.
Hi, my name is Sarah Reed. I work for an organization called WeGo, which supports informal workers like street vendors to organize. And I was, Philip, I was struck by your observation about the social media conversation around street vendors, and that it has been quite negative and it's been quite virulent even. And so I guess my part one question is that representative? Or do more people feel like the people in this room do about street food? And then if so, are you aware of any campaigns that are trying to present a more positive image, especially on social media, or is that something that could be done?
I was having a look for that website, which I think was a Facebook page that was really anti-vendor. And actually what I found was lots of supportive Save Our Street Foods pages. So I think that there is more probably out there supportive of it. But I've heard among people I know, probably more commonly at a higher social level of criticism. But I don't think these people walk on the streets very much. I think maybe tidy pavements as they drive past, I don't know. But also people said that it's the vendors, give them an inch and they'll take a mile. That they're not averse to vendors, but they don't like the way that vendors will take up all the space. I mean, there are many Bangkok streets that used to have markets. Now you can walk unimpeded, but there's absolutely no reason to walk there because the reason for going there is gone. On top of everything else, these awnings provide shade. They provide a reason to have a walk. I don't know how many Bangkok people are going to be going along, Hoi Kwang Street when there's no market down there. I mean, unless, or how many people are going to go into Bon Mahakam Park when they don't go into the park opposite on the other side of the road. I just think that there's a misconception about how to use the space, and a lot of people just feel a little bit like it doesn't represent them. It's dirty and low, and they don't really want to be associated with it.
But where there's food, there's ties, and where there's no food, there's no ties. It's as simple as that. And so there is that draw, as you say, into the streets, into the parks, into various areas, because the one thing that Thais do need at almost every time is food.
Sorry. street food is not pedestrian friendly. This is the only disadvantage of the street food.
I think cleanliness, I've probably heard even more than that. People talk about, I've seen where they wash the dishes.
Yeah.
I mean, if they, one of the proposals is to provide a central place to wash the dishes and somewhere to throw the old cooking oil and the old scraps of food. I mean, those seem quite sensible innovations to me.
Correct, yes.
Yeah.
I think when Samak was the governor of Bangkok, he suggested having hot water dishing centres, but I don't think he actually created any. I think he talked about it, but it never. That is an idea that's been around, but whether they should be mobile or whether each area should have that, and then whose land is it on, and who provides it, and who rents it at those stratospheric rents.
There's not really enough public land in Bangkok, so much is privately owned. Next question, please.
My name is Jimmy. I work in preserving indigenous textiles around Southeast Asia. But in my commute, I noticed two different things just today. A lot of people sitting in the back on my way up to Changwatana of the pickup trucks. And for a minute, I thought that was banned, but now it's back. And then on the second part, on the way here tonight, I had to jump over a puddle into a couple of cement pillars that were placed in the puddle right at the Mochi station connecting Charuchak and the Mochi BTS. And I just was wondering, who put those cement blocks there? Was that the government? Was that the BMA? Was that some kind of strategy? And it makes me kind of wonder whether or not there actually is a plan. Is there something that we're kind of preempting? Is this a languid and fluid problem-solving experiment that we're kind of watching from a little bit of a removed spot? But I would just wonder, do we know that? Is there a plan? Is it written somewhere? Can we read it or look at it? Or is it just going to kind of surf its way into whatever final result?
I think, sorry, just short one. I think they also arguing who's responsible for that concrete block. They're arguing.
I think there are laws, and they're quite often quite strict. And when you go back through history and look when all the strict laws were put in, you find they were generally by authoritarian governments in those periods, and that there's been quite a to and fro. You see this in things like the laws over gambling and lotteries. There's all this, is loose one time, strong another time. But very few laws get taken away in Thailand, so they tend to be very strict laws,
but they fall into
which
abeyance,
in terms of enforcement provide opportunities for some people in the enforcement aspect. In terms of, we're talking about the informal economy earlier, I think.
Yes. I mean, from my conversation with the city government, there obviously is a plan, and they were obviously changing it pretty quickly with all the flack that was coming their way. And there was sort of, the plan, I think, was to clear street food out, certainly from the centre completely.
But clearly not a comprehensive plan, because you have the tour actually talking about street food and how glorious it is, and on one hand, and then you have the BMA saying, well, we need to clear it and expunge it from the streets. So there might be a plan, but it certainly is not cohesive yet.
There's a bit of left-hand, right-hand stuff going on. Next question, please.
Good evening, Jonathan and our panellists. My name is Daniel. I'm from Australia. I've been in Bangkok for 2 years. And I just wanted to say that, thank you for your comments and everything you've shared with us tonight on behalf of us all. I think Jonathan said he may live in RE. There's a girl on the bar I've been chatting to. I think she lives in RE as well. And so if we all go to sleep tonight and close our eyes, and there's street food tonight, and open them up tomorrow, and there's no street food, then Bangkok is a very, very different place. However, my background is I'm an economist, probably a clapped-out economist, but in my soy in mid-Sukhumvit, there are 15 or 20 street vendors. They're run by families or nephews and nieces and people who make all these noodles, and this, that, and the other. And I'm just thinking of the soy economics and the suburban economics and the general economics. Has there ever been any quantification? And these people on a slow day, maybe they make 30 bowls of noodles on a bad rainy day, or on a sunny hot day, maybe they make 230 bowls of noodles. I just don't know. Has there ever been a quantification of what how many people this part of the socio-political, geo-human part of Bangkok employs, and actually what the turnover is? We know that there's a massive amount of cash flow that goes unaccounted throughout Southeast Asia. However, this is a huge economic thing that if authorities of one nature or the other are trying to subdue or redistribute or shut down entirely, is quite important. Has there been any microeconomic quantification of what street food vendors employ and what their maybe cash turnover per day, per week, per month, per year might be to the all-important inhabitants of Bangkok, Krung Thep, and Greater Thailand, for that matter?
Anyone got the answer? I know there's been research about it. Now
there's been an awful lot of academic research on small issues like this, or on individual traders, maybe not on the whole economy. But Mark Askew wrote a book about the local economies going on in the city of Bangkok. It's quite old now, it's nearly 20 years old. But I think there's been a lot of work on this. You find papers in universities on aspects of it, I'm sure.
The numbers certainly run into, I think it's hundreds of thousands if you include every definition of street vendors. So it's a massively significant part of the economy. Yeah.
But I think the tax, trying to get the tax from these people and trying to regularize the economy, if you look around the world, it's a major trend of the last few years, all the way from tax havens through to shutting down vendors. Governments everywhere are trying to cover every single thing that's going on economically and control it.
Next question, please.
Good evening. My name is Jack Hester. I'm a retired English and German teacher. I've lived in Bangkok for 17 years, and I live in Pahonyotin, Soi 3, which is in the central northern part of the city, on a tiny little soi called Soi 3. It's near Sanampao BTS station between Victory Monument and Aori, and has been largely residential ever since I've been there, but has changed dramatically because the new both sides of the tiny little street, and there is enormous, I think, government-style construction going on behind the soi. For the time that I have been there, there have been very excellent vendors, good street vendors with no sidewalks. The streets are tiny, there aren't any sidewalks. And so, but there have always been excellent vendors there, food vendors. And about 5 years ago, a tiny little hotel across the street named Vic 3 opened, and it was a bonanza for the street vendors there because of the tourists from Taiwan, Korea, China, and so on. But the place has always been very, very important for the local people and the working people in that area. So it's at least 50-50. My question is, this is a kind of an out-of-the-way place from the major street vending places that I think have been generally under discussion here. Does the Bangkok Metropolitan Administration have the intention of getting rid of these people as well?
I think The further away from the higher rent areas, the better the food, because the less rent that's charged, the more likely they are to be able to provide better food or able to provide better food. When you're further away from tourist areas, you have a more discriminating clientele, as it were, people who will eat in those stalls, and they will eat daily, and so consequently the standards are maintained because the vendors themselves wish to maintain their clientele. As to whether it will be cleared, it seems unlikely. It's in the main areas, as Jonathan, I think also other members of the panel were saying, it's in the central areas of Bangkok that they wish to clear in order to make it the beautiful, brave, modern city that they hope it will become. But I just feel that it's on those side soys and in those other areas away from modern Bangkok, you're more likely to find those vendors always available. And I have also some quite comfort too that even in the main part of the city, that whilst it might be cleared now, like mushrooms, those vendors will return because simply Thais like to eat, and Thais also engage in that local economy, that informal economy, and where there's a demand, there'll be entrepreneurs who'll cater to it.
Next question, please. I think I'll probably make this the last question, if that's all right.
Okay, privilege. My name's Kevin. I'm from Newcastle in England. From the discussion tonight, there's two sides. One, the colourful, anarchic, beautiful aspect of Bangkok expressed through street food, the organic nature of it. Fantastic. Don't the tourists just love it? On the other side, it's a bloody health hazard, a safety hazard. Along with motorbikes in some parts of Bangkok, you know, you can be walking along a narrow pavement, there's a flaring wok of fire, motorbikes coming at you. A lot to be said to clamp it down. But I tell you what, if they wanted to do that, give the people more time. I mean, one of the big issues here, I feel, is that it's so draconian, so quick. What about the income of the people who are dependent on creating the street food? So that's a big issue, which I think maybe we ought to highlight in this debate. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I'd just like to finish off by thanking our panel very much for covering this ground. There's a lot more to talk about, and you're free to come up and chat to them afterwards. Just one other thing that I should have mentioned at the beginning, and talking about other events coming up at the club. We do have our occasional quiz night. There is one tomorrow night here at the club. You should feel tempted to come along to that. It's a lot of fun. Come on your own, and you'll form up teams when you come here. The questions are very, very wide-ranging, and even trying to figure out what the answers are is quite a challenge. They're a huge amount of fun, so if you're free tomorrow night, come to the quiz night. It's a good one. Thanks all for coming tonight.